So this is going to be a little bit controversial, but let's just go for it. So in modern personality typing systems, you have this thing called the inferior function. I mean, this dates back to the writings of Jung himself, who posited that human beings have a dominant function. They have a way of thinking that they are predisposed towards. The opposite function to this function is going to be an inferior function. It's going to be weaker. It's going to be this weak little scrawny function that you can barely use and is pretty much standing out as the sore thumb of a personality type. It stands out as the Achilles heel of any given type. Well, what if I told you this is complete nonsense, that this is actually a myth and is a complete misunderstanding of how the cognitive stack actually works? You see, us as human beings, we tend to consecrate things that happened in the past. Because a system was made a certain amount of time ago, therefore it must have this kind of sacred quality. Therefore, whoever made it must be this kind of superhuman because, you know, miracles have only ever occurred in previous history and they never happen in the modern day because that's how history is written. It's the same thing for any kind of invention or theory. You see, Jung wasn't the person who started this theory, he himself borrowed from many other people before him, and we need to have a flexible attitude in order to continue letting our understanding of the human psyche developing and not overly consecrate previous conceptions. So yes, Carl Jung himself posited this inferior function, and yes, MBTI continued this into the future. And no, we have not really changed this theory since that point. There's been different interpretations, but you know, it's like the legislature, the legal precedent of any given country, and holy books. They're things that happened in the past, we consecrate them, and then the only progress we can ever make is through interpreting the original words. And as such, while in terms of government and whatnot, this is very helpful because it prevents society from going past a certain threshold. It prevents a government doing a certain amount of harm that they would otherwise be able to do through creating new legislation after new legislation without being held accountable to anything. But when it comes to theory, when it comes to psychology, when it comes to the softer sciences, we cannot afford to overly consecrate previous instruments because that will prevent us moving forward as it has done over the last 50 odd years. Rant over. Let's get to the point of this video. I posit through CPT that there's no such thing as an inferior function. There's no such thing as a function which is, as a default, a weak function. As a default, it's kind of Achilles heel for every individual. But I understand where this term comes from, because when we observe the behaviour of about half the people who correspond to any one personality type, we will notice this function is inferior. We notice the function's undeveloped, and we notice in the people who have this undeveloped function, they seem to be in this perpetual expeditious retreat from its employment. However, what we don't notice is half the other people actually have a developed function. They have a developed fourth function, they have a developed oppositional function, whatever you want to call it, the function is no longer inferior within half of people. So how is this adequate justification for labelling this function an inferior function? And wouldn't we say that all we ever achieve through their use and deployment and perpetuation of this term is create this dilemma whereby people are viewing their function in a negative light? By throwing around this terminology inferior, we're automatically predisposing somebody towards running away from that function, towards underutilizing it, and towards over-focusing on their convergent stack. This is no good for anybody. We cannot afford to keep calling this function an inferior function. I don't care what Jung said, I don't care what MBTI says, and I don't care what some person who is choosing to interpret the religious passages of any kind of Jungian or MBTI manuscript said. What I do care about is reality, and in reality we only see this function being inferior in half, and I'd even say less than half of cases. So it's not an inferior function, and I don't believe calling it an inferior function is healthy for anyone. And honestly, you can call it what you want, just don't call it the inferior function. Within CPT, we call it the oppositional function because it is a function that seeks to oppose the natural will, the natural dominance of the dominant function. It is a function which is authoritative and counteractive. It is a function that instills consequence. It is an authoritative function. It is also the function that presents the other side to a person's character, because if we were to rotate on our axis and employ our oppositional function in a convergent manner, we would essentially switch personalities to our natural opposite. And as such, I refer to it as the oppositional function. And after that rather long-winded introduction, I'm going to present 3 reasons to you now why I consider the oppositional function to not only be highly underrated, but also invaluable to our everyday cognitive performance. The first is the passive role this function plays within our stack. When employed in a passive manner, this is a divergent function. This is the most divergent function of the entire cognitive stack. Therefore, the oppositional function exerts a highly authoritative and consequence-instilling role. Think of it like a negative force. Think of it as a negative counterbalance. It grounds us in reality and ensures our convergent functions never get too carried away, never get too ahead of themselves in their constant seeking of novelty. The oppositional function holds us accountable and ensures we remain balanced human beings. And in any case whereby a person has an unbalanced relationship with their oppositional function, whereby they are suppressing it, whereby they're in constant retreat from its development and employment, you find this person is riddled with anxiety. They may not even be that aware of it, especially if their oppositional function is a feeling function in the first place. But you'll notice the person tends to make bad decisions, they act without consequence, and they tend to act in a way which doesn't seem particularly rational or even self-preservative. In fact, these people will often have self-destructive tendencies. That's because when we run away from our oppositional function, we're running away from the function that enables us to be real, that allows us to survive, that enables us to live a fulfilling, meaningful existence and anchors us into reality. So anybody with an unbalanced relationship between dominant and oppositional function are going to be living in relative pandemonium. Even if it's a person with, let's say, an extroverted thinking or introverted thinking oppositional function who just wants to follow another person's rule sets and let another person make decisions, or let another institution or authority make decisions on their behalf and essentially live their life for them, this person is still going to be living in a relative state of pandemonium. Such a person is still going to have self-destructive tendencies because they are surrendering control and responsibility for their own life. And let's say in my case, an INFJ, extroverted sensing allows me to anchor into reality. It allows me to achieve my dreams. It allows me to positively affect the social world around me. It allows me to absorb the social world around me and actually intake information from the external world in the first place. If I had a complete denial of this function and if I was in constant retreat from it, I wouldn't even be taking in external information because this is my primary lens. All I'd be taking in is this kind of vague, extroverted, intuitive lens, which is primarily oriented inwards. Therefore, the information I'm getting from my extroverted intuition will only ever be ephemeral, vague, surreal in nature. But it is extroverted sensing that allows me to engage with reality. It is extroverted sensing that allows me to be truly alive and is overall conducive to my survival as a human being because it enables me to navigate the external world. And don't get me wrong, I know that even in the worst possible situations of this inferior function, of a negative relationship with this inferior function, you still have people who are at least using it on some level. But I would still argue that most people, or at least half of people, use it on a level which is far above this kind of minimal basic threshold required for something equivalent to survival and happiness. I'd actually argue people use it quite effectively, that an extrovert thinking oppositional person will be intaking rules and understanding rules quite effectively in order to abide by them, while still having a responsibility sufficient as to pick what rules they're going to be complying with in the first place. You'll have an introverted sensor who's building a life for themselves, who's building a past, who's actually in their constant seeking of new experiences, leaving something behind, leaving a legacy and actually channeling their energies, their creative energies, into building something for themselves and maybe a family that they'll be creating one day. You'll have an introverted thinking oppositional thinking for themselves. You'll have an extroverted sensing oppositional anchoring into the moment and actually realizing their dreams. The list goes on and on. The inferior function is not an inferior function, it just has a divergent nature. What do I mean by this? A divergent function, especially a highly divergent function such as this one, is one which is negative and it seeks to, rather than create its own rules, take in rules from the external world. It's one that seeks to, rather than create its own concrete reality, just abide by the concrete reality. But this isn't inferior, this is sensible, this is logical. We need a balance of our own rules and our own way of doing things and the pre-existing reality and the pre-existing rules. And we need to find a compromise between this convergent nature of ours and our divergent nature. So as the passive state of this oppositional function is the most divergent out of all the attitudes within our stack, we are relying on it as an important counterweight. We are relying on it to instill a sense of consequence and to hold ourselves accountable to reality. However, this function is not always passive in nature, and that leads me to point number 2. We can actually use this function in a convergent manner. We can swivel on the axis between dominant and oppositional in order to effectively switch our cognitive stack around, turn ourselves upside down, and tap into our second person. The second person leads from the oppositional. This is when the oppositional function is acting as an alternate dominant. This is when the oppositional function is taking the lead. So if I were to rotate on my axis, I would be leading with extrovert sensing and extrovert feeling as a convergent duo. This would be like the stack of an ESTP with introverted intuition and introverted thinking performing a supplementary role and envisioning a future and envisioning a framework for me to be held accountable to, because now these two functions are playing a divergent role. And when I say second person, I'm not referring to this Jekyll and Hyde scenario, but rather presenting a different side of our cognitive stack that enables us to switch our attitudes on their heads and actually act in a manner which is contrary to our dominant natural orientation. So an introvert using this method can act like an extrovert, and an extrovert an introvert, vice versa. And this is why I don't strictly believe in dichotomies such as introverted and extroverted, or even thinking and feeling, because everything's on a spectrum and everything can be rotated, everything can be turned on its head. And this is why INFJs, especially when I have a highly developed oppositional function, and I consider my oppositional function, I don't know, above average, but I wouldn't say highly developed. But even for myself, I can still be charismatic in a intense social situation. I can still employ my highly focused extrovert sensing lens with an auxiliary of extrovert feeling in order to enhance the social atmosphere overall. I'm not just abiding by it, but I'm actually taking control of it. I'm actually acting in a convergent manner. Much in the same way as a highly developed ENFJ, for example, will be able to access their introverted thinking frameworks and assess them and come up with their own theories, come up with their own modes of thought, and no longer rely on authorities to instill knowledge into them. They can come up with their own knowledge and they can find their own connections. And this isn't even a rare phenomenon. This isn't a transcendent function. And this isn't even a highly individuated state. This is pretty average. Most people can do this. Most people can rotate on their axis and access their second person to such an extent as to be able to switch their orientation around. And I assure you, when people are engaging the oppositional function in this convergent manner, they are proving this entire inferior function notion a complete myth. If you see people engage their oppositional function in a convergent manner, you will notice that this inferior function thing no longer holds up. But with that being said, I will concede that this tends not to be employed for long durations of time. And as such, I will concede that this function is, as a default, relatively inferior insofar as the durations we can employ it for. So if I were to use my extrovert sensing in a convergent manner, I will still not be able to keep that up for a prolonged amount of time in the same way a default ESTP would, just as an ESTP would not be able to reflect upon their internal cogitations in the same way that I can, for the same duration that I can. So duration is a factor here, absent a certain amount of training, but I would still argue that this duration does not have a sufficient impact upon the effectiveness of a person's cognitive stack, upon the effectiveness of a person's oppositional function, in order to justify the continued use of this derogatory term inferior. So as such, not only is the oppositional function in its dormant and passive state performing a very important divergent role within the stack, but it can also be switched around completely in order to act as an alternate dominant. And this leads me to the grand finale. The dominant function and the oppositional function are two sides of the same coin. They are essentially the same function because they exist on the same continuum. It's just that the dominant is one extreme of this, while the oppositional is the other extreme. But they are still dipping in and out of each other constantly. Rather than being two separate blocks which are completely irreconcilable, they are in fact upon the same spectrum. They are upon the same continuum. They are two sides of the same coin. So using myself as an example, the INFJ cognitive stack, when I'm engaging my introverted intuition, which is my dominant function, I am simultaneously dipping in to my oppositional, albeit with the reverse orientation of its natural state. I'm engaging introverted intuition and dipping in to introverted sensing. If I did not do this, I would not be able to rationalize anything. I would not be able to perceive anything, because introverted intuition on its own, without any kind of introverted sensing specificity, cannot perceive details. It cannot do details. All it can see is this vague kaleidoscopic collage of different colors and moving images. It can't be specific, it can't be scientific, and it can't be rational. Just as introverted sensing without introverted intuition is unable to perceive the big picture. It can only ever focus on this tiny little detail, and it can never ever see anything beyond that. It can never see how any of those details connect to a bigger picture. But in reality, people don't operate like this. Introverted sensors use introverted intuition just as introverted intuitives use introverted sensing, because if they did not, they would be completely irrational. But just as these two modes of thought are two sides of the same continuum, so are the two different orientations of any given style of thought. Let's say it's thinking or feeling, or sensing or intuitizing. They are the same function. It doesn't matter if it says it's introverted or extroverted. Just because they have an additional name asserted as a prefix, it doesn't mean these two things are completely different. This does not mean they aren't the same function. They are. It just makes it easier to communicate it to people, the differences between these two modes of thought, when you separate these two things into separate containers. My point is that my extroverted intuition is the same as my introverted intuition. They're both the same function, just as my extroverted sensing is the same as my introverted sensing. So when I say I'm dipping in to my oppositional function, I really do mean that. I'm not just arbitrarily, for the sake of my own argument, replacing extroverted sensing with introverted sensing. I'm pointing out that these two things are the same function. When I'm dipping into introverted sensing, I'm dipping in to my oppositional function. When I'm dipping into extroverted intuition, when I'm engaging my extroverted sensing in a convergent or divergent manner, I'm still dipping into my dominant function. So no matter what function is convergent at any one time, your dominant function or your oppositional function, you are still going to be employing the opposite function. You are still employing one function in order to effectively use the function it naturally opposes. I've said it before and I'll say it again. There are no boxes within this system. There are no boxes within CPT. There are no boxes within psychology as a whole. We use boxes just to help elucidate truths in order to form artificial and temporary binary constructs for as long as it takes to gradually perceive over time the many shades of grey in between these two extremes. And once we've perceived those shades, as we have over the last 100 years since this theory's conception, we no longer need to think in boxes. We no longer need to think in terms of opposites. We no longer need to think in extremes. We no longer need to use this list of top-down functions used by preferences. We no longer need to assign convoluted metaphors to each and every function, or even needlessly distinguish between an extrovert function and an introvert function when they are in reality the same thing. But will I continue to use these terms? Absolutely. I'm a human being. I need to use extremes in order to communicate effectively. I need to use terms like introverted intuition as opposed to extroverted intuition in order to create a framework within which I can perceive the micro-interactions, within which I can perceive the degrees to which introverted intuition is used in preference, in deference to extroverted intuition. But while we will continue to speak in these hyperbolic human terms, that doesn't mean we cannot do so with a mutual understanding of the intricacies within, that we cannot do so without taking in our stride the fact that we are speaking in generalizations. But while I will defend the necessity of certain binary constructs and hyperbolisms for effective communication, for setting a topic, for setting a region of an area to explore, this doesn't mean I'm happy to continue using terms that I consider outdated, that I consider archaic, and that I consider not only contradictory to reality, but also encouraging of a negative mindset. A negative mindset that kind of defeats the purpose of a theory constructed primarily for development of the self. So a bit of a controversial topic, but I hope people resonated with that. I'd absolutely love to hear your own takes on this matter. Do you believe that this function is inferior? Do you believe this inferior function should be given a different name? What do you think that name should be? What's your personal relationship with your oppositional function, and how useful do you find it within your stack? As usual, I'd absolutely love to hear from you in the comments below. Leave a like in the video, it really does help the channel grow, develop and reach new audiences, and if you haven't already done so, click that subscribe button too to stay notified of future videos. I upload a new video every single week, so I'll be back same place, same time next week. Take care.